The ship hit the water, engine tipped onto its side, and nothing happened. No giant explosion. No stainless steel confetti. No dramatic fireball lighting up the Indian Ocean. After years of Starship test flights ending like rejected Michael Bay scenes, SpaceX Flight 13 did something almost unsettling. It survived. But the missing explosion wasn't the only surprise hiding inside this mission. Because while Starship completed what may have been its cleanest return yet, the Super Heavy booster suffered a failure that could be far more serious than one hard splashdown. So why didn't Starship explode, and why might the booster's problem matter even more? On July 24, 2026, SpaceX launched the 13th integrated test flight of its Starship system from Starbase, Texas. The complete vehicle stood more than 400 feet tall, making it the largest and most powerful rocket system ever flown. The mission's upper stage wasn't trying to enter a permanent orbit. Instead, it followed a suborbital path halfway around the planet before descending toward the Indian Ocean. Along the way, Starship deployed 20 next-generation Starlink V3 spacecraft. These spacecraft weren't expected to remain in space. They were temporary test payloads designed to validate Starship's deployment mechanism and gather data before eventually re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Think of the mission as testing a brand new pickup truck by loading the bed, flooring it across the desert, driving through an industrial furnace, and then trying to park it gently in the middle of an ocean. Except the pickup truck is the size of a skyscraper and filled with cryogenic methane and liquid oxygen. Starship's most dangerous challenge began when it started coming home. At orbital-class speeds, a spacecraft can't simply point its nose toward Earth and hope for the best. The atmosphere becomes a wall. Air in front of the vehicle compresses violently, creating temperatures hot enough to weaken or destroy ordinary metals. That's why Starship's belly is covered in thousands of black thermal protection tiles. The ship enters sideways, exposing its broad heat shield to the atmosphere. This position creates enormous drag, allowing the vehicle to lose speed without using most of its remaining fuel. It's similar to a skydiver spreading out their arms and legs to slow down, but this skydiver is traveling thousands of miles per hour and wearing a stainless steel spacesuit. During Flight 13, Starship appeared to complete its cleanest re-entry yet. Its control flaps continued working. The ship remained stable. Its structure stayed largely intact, and the heat shield appeared to survive without the widespread damage seen during several earlier flights. SpaceX also turned the mission into a flying laboratory. Sensors across the ship measured pressure, temperature, and aerodynamic forces during re-entry. Some of the deployed Starlink spacecraft even carried cameras that photographed Starship from space. That gave engineers an external view of the vehicle while it was passing through one of the most violent parts of the mission. And then came the landing maneuver. Starship descended horizontally in its belly flop position. Seconds before reaching the ocean, it fired its engines, swung its tail downward, and rotated into a vertical orientation. This flip and burn maneuver is one of the most dramatic parts of the entire Starship design. The vehicle waits until it's uncomfortably close to the surface before using rocket thrust to cancel its remaining speed. On Flight 13, it worked. The ship slowed, lowered itself toward the ocean, touched the water, and then tipped onto its side. That's normally where the fireball arrives, but this time, it didn't. The reason is surprisingly simple. The ship probably never experienced the violent structural rupture needed to create a major explosion. Starship's body isn't just wrapped around separate fuel tanks. Large sections of the spacecraft are the tanks. Its thin stainless steel structure holds extremely cold methane and oxygen under pressure. If the vehicle strikes the water too quickly or collapses sideways, those tanks can split open. The propellants escape, mix, encounter heat or an ignition source, and suddenly the ocean gets its own artificial sunrise. Flight 13 appears to have avoided that chain reaction because the touchdown was exceptionally gentle. The engines removed enough vertical speed that the vehicle didn't slam into the water. It settled down first and rolled over afterward. It's the difference between placing a soda can on a table and crushing that same can with a baseball bat. The object is identical, The forces acting on it are not. Small flames were visible around the floating ship, so this wasn't a perfectly controlled recovery. But the vehicle didn't immediately break apart, and its tanks apparently remained intact enough to prevent a large detonation. That doesn't prove every system worked perfectly. It doesn't prove the ship could be refueled and launched again. But it does mean Starship survived re-entry, the landing burn, contact with the water, and the final tip over without instantly destroying itself. And that's a major step toward reuse. Before we get to the booster problem, which may be the mission's real warning sign, take a second to subscribe and hit like, and tell me in the comments. Would you trust SpaceX's plan to catch Starship with a launch tower, or would you feel safer seeing traditional landing legs? Because, yes, the eventual plan is to catch this spacecraft out of the sky. SpaceX doesn't want future Starships landing in the ocean. Salt water is extremely destructive to engines, electronics, valves, and almost everything else engineers would like to reuse. The long-term goal is to guide Starship back toward the launch site and capture it using the tower's enormous mechanical arms. Landing legs would be easier to understand, but they would also add weight. And in rocketry, every additional pound means less payload, less fuel margin, or less performance. A tower catch removes the need for heavy landing hardware, potentially allowing the ship to be inspected, refueled, and launched again much faster. But SpaceX can't safely attempt that until it trusts every part of the return sequence: the thermal protection system, the control flaps, the engines, the guidance software, and the ship's internal propellant management. Flight 13 showed that the upper stage may be getting close. And now comes the plot twist. While Starship's landing was almost suspiciously calm, the Super Heavy booster had a very different return. During its descent, 5 engines reportedly failed to relight correctly. Without enough thrust to slow itself, the booster struck the Gulf of Mexico much harder than planned. At first, that might sound like a smaller issue. After all, the booster was always going into the ocean. Why does it matter whether it arrived gently or hit the water like a 200-foot steel lawn dart? Because engine relight reliability sits at the center of SpaceX's entire recovery strategy. Super Heavy uses different groups of engines during different parts of the return. Some help reverse its direction after stage separation. Others restart near the surface to perform the final landing burn. Those engines have to ignite at exactly the right moment while the booster is falling through the atmosphere, and restarting a rocket engine during flight is much harder than starting one on the launch pad. Propellant is moving inside enormous tanks. Pressure must remain within narrow limits. Turbopumps need to accelerate correctly. Fuel and oxidizer must arrive in the proper amounts, and ignition has to happen without damaging the engine. If several engines fail together, the booster may not have enough thrust or enough control authority to recover safely. That's more than a bad landing. It raises questions about whether the problem came from the engines themselves, the fuel delivery system, tank pressure, software commands, or conditions created during the descent. And SpaceX needs to understand that before it attempts increasingly aggressive booster recoveries near critical ground infrastructure. Starship's economic promise depends on reusing both stages, recovering only the upper stage while repeatedly losing Super Heavy would be an extremely expensive way to build artificial reefs. This is why experimental flights can be both successful and unsuccessful at the same time. Flight 13 demonstrated a cleaner re-entry, successful payload deployment, controlled upper stage descent, and an unexpectedly gentle splashdown. It also exposed a booster issue that could become a major obstacle if it repeats. That's not a contradiction. That's how flight testing works. The purpose isn't to prove the machine is already perfect. The purpose is to push it far enough that the remaining weaknesses become impossible to hide. And that brings us back to the moment Starship touched the ocean. The ship hit the water, tipped onto its side, and nothing happened. The missing explosion wasn't a missing spectacle. It was the good news. But the booster's hard impact was the reminder that SpaceX still hasn't solved every part of the journey home. One vehicle showed how close reusable spaceflight may be getting. The other showed how far it still has to go. Someday, Spacecraft landings safely may become so routine that nobody stops to watch. Airliners don't make international headlines because their wings stayed attached. Cargo ships don't go viral because they reached port without sinking. Reliable transportation eventually becomes boring. And boring technology is usually the technology that changes civilization. So, tower catch or landing legs, which one would you trust with your ride home from space? Drop your answer below, subscribe for the next flight breakdown, and remember, stay curious, fly smart,